I thank you all for joining us today and tonight to go through a summary of our draft Phase 2 comprehensive site assessment that we submitted to Mass DEP on December 31st. Let me see if I can figure out how to do this. Okay. Here's a list of contacts for you. You know, Bill met me. I am a principal environmental engineer at SLR International Corporation. My elevator speech on what I do is that I am a storyteller, an environmental storyteller. And here you'll see us reference Eric Teal. His first name is Charles, but he goes by Eric. So if you see Charles E. Teal and you hear Eric, that's what we're talking about, the same person. And here's the email addresses to submit your written questions either to Bill or myself, and we will make sure they get routed to the correct person. And as in echoing what Bill said, we have this fantastic project technical team, all of whom have done a fantastic job of gathering the lines of evidence to put together the story of 111 Dedham Street, radiological, multiple field investigations, ecological, and human health risk assessments. Our purpose tonight is to provide you a progress report on and help you understand where we stand with understanding the environmental conditions at the site and to provide you with the opportunity to ask us questions. To start with, here's a bulleted list of the site background. We all know the history as a hospital that conducted radiological research. From an environmental perspective, it's important that there were supporting operations that included the use of underground storage tanks that contained oil, and that there was discharge at the site of sanitary wastewater that went to the filtration beds and solid waste that went to the former waste disposal area. You see multiple firms here and lots of long history of the investigation. And those investigations were primarily focused on where contamination was likely to be located based on historical site use. And we used judgmental sampling to evaluate the extent of any identified contamination at the site. So that was kind of the approach that we took to the investigation. And here's a list of historical owners of this property. In 2002, EarthTech first broke this site into areas of concern, 7 of them, AOCs 1 through 7. You can see them listed here. The ones that we focus primarily on are AOC 2 and AOC 7, which are connected. That is the area of free phase petroleum called LNAPL, light non-aqueous phase liquid. AOC5 is the the wastewater filtration beds, where we've seen some radiological waste. That's where the wastewater from the facility was discharged historically. And the third one is AOC6 of the primary ones. That is where the former waste disposal area. If you look on this figure, you can also see these little brown circles. Those are the underground storage tanks where there was historical storage of petroleum. And so a lot of the releases occurred, for petroleum releases occurred from those tanks. AOC 8 was added, again by EarthTech, but at a later date when they had evaluated and found a release near the former maintenance garage. So those are the 8 AOCs that we kind of talk about in our phase 2. This is a bulleted list it's a little bit wordy, but it's a summary of the recent field investigations and activities that have occurred since 111 Dedham, the current owner, purchased the property. We have excavation of test pits, lots of soil borings, different phases of soil borings, soil samples, groundwater samples. There was radiological surveys, there was sediment sampling, surface water sampling, risk assessments, and a lot of kind of specific testing that is related to trying to see underground, looking for historical buildings, laser-induced fluorescence, which is looking for the extent of that LNAPL, that free phase petroleum, and some horizontal elevation surveys. of the wells and the borings. So quite a bit of work that's been done since about 2021 at this site. This site just gives you a brief snapshot of the historical exploration locations with regards to the AOC. Like I said, we used a judgmental sampling approach, so the locations were selected based on where we would expect to see either discharges from tanks or receiving bodies from where wastewater or solid waste would have been discharged. I'm going to do just a quick summary here of the field activities and the significant results from the work that was done under the targeted brownfield assessment by NOBIS under US EPA contract. And I'll do that by AOC. AOC1 is the power plant area. And you can see here that they did soil and groundwater sampling. And in short, that sampling basically confirmed that the previous remediation that was done in this area was adequate in making sure that the contamination was addressed. We did have one detection of arsenic at a concentration of 21, and the standard is 20. So higher than the standard, but only by a slight amount. And petroleum constituents were all below the Method 1 standards. In AOC2, the UST area, this is the area where we did a lot of work associated with that free-phase petroleum or the LNAPL. They did what I said earlier was the laser-induced fluorescence or LIF survey. That's the Targost you see there. And basically what that is a probe is pushed into the ground and it shoots a laser out, and the response that you get back gives them an idea of whether there's petroleum, free-phase petroleum present in the subsurface and where it is. So that was a pretty extensive survey, and what they found from that is that the extent of that LNAPL really has not changed since 2002, and I'll have a slide later that kind of shows the confirmation of that. In addition to that survey, they did 12 soil borings. They did a lot of soil sampling and analysis on both the horizontal and the vertical extent. They showed that petroleum contamination doesn't appear to have migrated very far laterally or downward. And they also found that there was no evidence of dissolved petroleum exceedances. So that was all good news. AOC3 is an intermittent stream. There was sediment and surface water sampling there. The sampling was primarily focused on trying to see if releases from other areas of the site had impacted that intermittent stream area. They did look for radium in those samples and found that although there did appear to be impacts from the filtration beds, they also found radium concentrations upstream, which suggested that there's a background component to the radium detections at the site. AOC4, there was one boring that was done there. We did have an exceedance, but other than that one exceedance, there didn't seem to be any significant impacts. AOC5 is those wastewater treatment filter beds. As we discussed, a lot of radiological screening surveys, soil borings collected, and we'll discuss the results there a little bit later. We did some PFAS sampling. You can see kind of the results there. AOC6 was that former waste disposal area. Again, we really focused on this area as a receiving body for some of the contamination that would have potentially emanated from the site. There was test pits done in 2022, soil borings ranging from 20 to 80 feet deep, soil samples collected with analysis for many, many compounds. And there was one detection of PFAS and one detection of lead and a combustion product, benzoate pyrene, that exceeded the applicable standards. Radiological screening was done during all of those borings, and everything was consistent with background. We did groundwater sampling, and then just recently, a couple weeks ago, we did 9 additional borings to define that hotspot that we identified for lead in the sampling that occurred in the original soil borings. And the final two AOCs, AOC 7 is tied to AOC 2. Basically, the same analyses and work was done in AOC 7 as we did in AOC 2. And the results were supported what we found with AOC 2. And AOC 8 was the former maintenance garage. And again, kind of like AOC 1, that one really was the investigation there was designed to confirm that historical remediation was adequate, and it did do that. So we collected the data, and the gathered data was used to generate a picture of the site, both above ground and below ground. What you see in this slide is a summary of the site features and topography, which is this is a mix of developed land and undeveloped land. There's an elevation difference of about 150 feet between the north and the south, with the ground sloping from the north towards the Stop River to the south. And we saw that that central area, as you all know, is developed and graded to allow building construction. What that told us underground, what we saw above ground told us underground, there's fill material present in those developed areas from the past construction. And beneath that fill is glacial outwash material, which is basically sand and gravel deposits that were put down by melting glaciers. Underlying that outwash is a thick layer of dense glacial till, which is a mix of variable size material. It's really tightly packed together, and it was, because it got deposited by the moving glaciers, and the glaciers are heavy, and they packed all of that material tightly together. There is bedrock pretty deep at the site, about 97 feet south of AOC 6. And we did find from a geologic perspective that that till being so tight is a barrier to groundwater movement downward. It does prevent a connection between water that's up on the top, groundwater that's on the top, and groundwater that's deeper. And that's the hydrogeology aspect of this, that there is groundwater in the sand and gravel layers above the glacial till. This is a perched water table, and that till layer limits that vertical flow and kind of keeps that separate from the deeper groundwater at the site. We did find that that deeper groundwater flows southward towards the wetlands. And those geological and hydrogeological conditions do limit contaminant migration at the site, which is a good thing. These next three slides are our geologic cross sections. And you kind of think about these as if we could stand, about 30 feet down in the ground and cut a slice, and what you would see if we looked sideways at the earth. You do see the ground surface. You see where our boring locations are. And you can see the geology that I was just speaking about. And we interpret this based on what we see in individual borings. Here you can see that this location, or this slice, goes from basically, let's see, south to north approximately, in the area where we have that free phase El Napple. You can see where we talk about having those glacial outwash deposits. You can see a discontinuous layer in yellow here of that El Napple, or that free phase petroleum. You have those really dense till materials that have some boulders in them, just a lot of variable size materials. You see another glacial outwash deposit below that. And then you see the bedrock below that. Here's that perched water table that we talk about. And here you can really see that in these shallow borings, this is where we hit water here. But when you go deeper, you hit a different water zone here. And so there's really two separate water zones. This one we call perched, and this one we call our deep aquifer. Here's another cross section. This is the main hospital building here, the Dayland building. And this section runs from that building over through here, which is the former waste disposal area, down that steep slope and towards the Stop River. You can see that deep topography kind of head off this direction and slope downwards. You see a lot of what we just saw expanded in the last cross section up here, this glacial till and the outwash. We see this perched water here. We really don't know how this all ends because we didn't, have borings in here to tell us exactly. But then when we pick up these borings, which are deeper, you see the deeper groundwater here. Here we don't see the glacial till. It kind of just peters out in there somewhere, pinches out. And the third cross section is laterally, so see the Dalen building would have kind of been up in this area, and it goes along this El Napple plume that we found, and you can see just a lot of the same with the deeper aquifer here, shallow aquifer here, and this El Napple kind of in discontinuous zones. It isn't consistent across the whole. Based on the fact that we had a perched water table up here in this area of the developed area of the site, it's kind of difficult to look at groundwater flow in that area. We have a lot of dry wells. We have some areas where the groundwater flow is controlled by things other than the regional conditions. So we decided that we were going to look at regional groundwater flow because that really is what would dominate and affect migration of contamination on a regional scale. We were limited a little bit because we could only use the deep, the borings that extended into the deep aquifer. But what we saw when we did that is that we have groundwater flowing in basically a west-southwest direction, which makes sense with topography. And this is where the story of the site begins, this conceptual site model. And a conceptual site model here, I'll just read, is the story of how contamination got into the ground, where it is currently, how it moved there, and how it may continue to move to potentially come in contact with human or environmental receptors. We found 2 key points associated with our conceptual site model. One being that each AOC represented a discrete historical release, except for AOC 2 and 7, which originated from the same release. There was discrete releases from the USTs. The AOC 5 is considered separate from AOC 6, and so we ended up with discrete releases in this key point. The second key point, which we just kind of talked through, is that site conditions and geology in the developed area have limited migration of contamination both horizontally and vertically. That area was where a lot of the USTs were located. The petroleum discharges happened there, or the releases happened there. And the El Napple's up there, but we found that geology has really confined its movement over time. We did do specific conceptual site models for some of the primary contaminants of concern in the site. One of them is radium. Kind of all know the history of radium. It was brought to the site in 27 for cancer treatment research. And we also did find it's naturally occurring in background concentrations. The hospital wastewater, which contained radium, was filtered through the sand filter beds in AOC 5. And when those filter beds clogged, they would excavate the top layer of sand and debris and remove it to put it either adjacent to the filter beds or to separate dewatering beds. Our extensive phase assessment included on-site surveys, analytical testing of soil and groundwater, on-site screening during other investigative groundwater disturbance activities, and evaluation of those risks. The assessment results indicated that impacts to shallow soil in and nearby AOC 5 caused an estimated 911 cubic yards of radium impacted soil to be present above the guideline values that were established. The next couple figures really are associated with AOC 3 and the sediment sampling that was done for radium at the site. And the purpose of these is really to show that this is radium-226, and these darker colors are the higher concentrations that were found in sediment. And you can see that they are to some, kind of downstream or down gradient of where we would expect to see with those filter beds. But you can see there's also areas of the orange color up here where radium was identified in sediment that wouldn't have been impacted from the releases, the wastewater releases from the hospital. So this information, tells us that there are background concentrations. And in addition, DDES's surveys kind of indicated the same information, the same to be true. Same kind of information for radium-228. We do see some areas where there's potentially impacts, but we also see some other areas where there could be naturally occurring background impacts. The second contaminant of concern we looked at was PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are not compounds that we know to have been used or anticipate that were commonly used at the hospital historically, but they are pretty ubiquitous throughout the environment. And although we are not aware of any specific use at the site, they were used in a lot of other. They were kind of included and contained in other compounds that could have been used. And so we wanted to make sure we took a look for PFAS and see if there was any historical releases that would have resulted in significant releases of PFAS to the site. And just like everywhere else, we would have expected to see those at areas that either received wastewater or solid waste at the site. So we really focused on AOC 5 and AOC 6. At AOC 5, there was SLR 16, where we did have detections of PFAS in soil and groundwater, but they were only detected above the laboratory's reporting limits. They were below the standards. And we didn't see them at concentrations that would be indicative of a historical release of PFAS in wastewater. They just weren't high enough. In AOC 6, we did detect PFAS in one shallow soil sample that was above the applicable standard, but we didn't find it in any other soil samples that were collected in that AOC. So again, that suggested that AOC 6 is not a significant source for PFAS in groundwater. We just don't see it at high enough concentrations. We did see that PFAS in groundwater samples we collected, oh gosh, Denise, I don't remember how many, maybe 9 across the site, right? 9 groundwater samples or so across the site. And in 3 of those locations, the concentrations of PFAS in groundwater exceeded the Method 1 standard of 20 nanograms per liter. However, the maximum concentration of those PFAS 6, which is the sum of 6 regulated compounds in the state of Massachusetts, that's kind of the way they do it. That criteria is 20, and the highest concentration we had of that sum was 40.71 in a sample from SLR 22. So again, this distribution of PFAS in groundwater and the concentrations really were not high enough to be indicative that there was a significant release from historical operations at the site. We didn't see it in soil, and we really don't see kind of that smoking gun in groundwater that would, suggest that something happened historically. And so our results suggest that PFAS in groundwater may be associated with regional conditions. And finally, we did a conceptual site model for LNAPL for that free phase petroleum. We know the source of the LNAPL is the historical release of number 6 from the USTs at AOC 1. The historical movement of that material was likely through gravity, through the sheer volume of material released, and the fact that there was increased temperatures subsurface at the time when the hospital was operational, because the underground steam lines would have generated heat, and that decreases the viscosity of the number 6 fuel oil, which is highly viscous and very sticky. It doesn't tend to flow, it tends to stick. But when you heat it up, it will start to flow a little bit more. And our hypothesis is that is how this material moved to its current configuration. Our LNAPL assessment and analytical testing indicated that the distribution of number 6 fuel oil is stable. It's at what we call residual saturation. And it appears to be stable since at least 2002. And my next slides show a comparison of what EarthTech did in 2002 and what we show now. LNAPL, its movement is, like I said, restricted by its viscosity. It just doesn't really want to go anywhere. The geology, that glacial till that kind of doesn't allow it to move vertically or downward. It's got a low hydraulic gradient. It's a perched water table, and it really doesn't have anywhere to go. And also potentially the physical barrier of the main hospital building. And we also found that there's limited solubility of number 6 fuel oil. And so there's not much in way of dissolved phase contamination in the groundwater. So we do have a free phase, but it doesn't seem to be contributing to other types of contamination associated with petroleum. And this is the figure where in 2002, this is the extent that Earth Tech thought based on their limited soil borings. And you can see here that we did a little bit refinement, but really the two, from a lateral perspective, are pretty close. You know, we've done a lot more borings, gathered a lot more data, and refined the extent, but they are pretty similar. And now I'm going to hand it over to Denise, who is going to explain how that data was used to evaluate the risks that contamination could pose to human and ecological receptors. Denise.
Thanks, Gina. As a reminder, my name is Denise Mezzo, and I'm a toxicologist and risk assessor at Collaborative Risk Solutions. So I prepared the Method 3 risk characterization for human health, safety, and public welfare, and I will discuss those. But first, I'm going to summarize the environmental risk assessment. And I just want to acknowledge I did not prepare this. This was prepared by Tetra Tech, and it evaluated AOC3, which is the intermittent stream and sediment associated wetlands. And their assessment is included as Appendix F of the CSA. That's the Comprehensive Site Assessment, also known as a Phase 2. So if you're looking for this, you got to go to Appendix F. And so Tetra Tech assessed the environmental risk through toxicity testing. And they first went and considered sediment and surface water analytical data, both from the site throughout AOC3 and reference location upstream. And the reason that we consider reference locations is to understand what the conditions would be absent any release from the site. So that was the upstream locations as well. And in order to evaluate the environmental risk via this stage 2 approach, they did sediment toxicity testing. And what that is a lab-based test where the site sediment is essentially inoculated with organisms. And then we observe the organisms over time and to determine whether that sediment is harmful to those organisms. And really it evaluates both survival and growth of those organisms. Those are the kind of the endpoints that are evaluated. At the same time that the site sediment is being assessed at the lab is also looking at the same assessment with the laboratory control material or sediment and the reference location sediment. So that would be the upstream sediment. And then for understanding the potential for risk, Tetra Tech evaluated the results of those tests for the site sediment as well as the lab and upstream sediments and concluded that the overall impacts based on an evaluation of survival and growth of benthic organisms were not biologically significant. So what that means is they were not significantly different between the site sediments and the other sediments. So sort of the end point of that is simply that the impacts to the sediments and surface water do not appear to be impacting the environment at AOC3. So now I'll get to the human health risk assessment. And so I can say a lot on this topic, but I think for the purposes of tonight, I'm going to kind of orient everybody to the report and go through kind of the high points and the conclusions. It's included as Appendix E to the CSA. So if you want to kind of dive in deeper, that's where you should look. So for human health risk assessment, it really is composed of four parts, and each of the parts are identified here. And in the report, Section 1 of the Method 3 risk characterization is kind of general site information. Section 2 is the hazard identification. And the hazard identification is where we identify the contaminants or the chemicals that are retained for the risk evaluation. They're called constituents of concern or COCs. So for this report, all the compounds that were detected in soil and sediment and groundwater with the exception of one compound, anthracene in soil. Other than anthracene, everything else was retained and kind of carried through the risk assessment. Anthracene in soil was the only thing that was kind of excluded. And the reason that it was excluded was because it was present in background, present in soil at concentrations consistent with background. And so under the MCP, kind of by default, that means there's not a significant sort of site-related risk because if the site was not there, the anthracene would still be present at that concentration. The risk assessment also did not include radium. That was evaluated separately. And that is because the way one evaluates the risks to radiological contamination is different than the way we evaluate risks to all of the other COCs. So it's like apples and oranges. So radium was assessed, just not within this report. Section 3 of the Method 3 risk characterization is the exposure assessment. And that is where human exposures, human receptors are identified for assessment in the risk characterization. For this site, the current receptors include trespassers, and we assume that trespassers are exposed to shallow soil across the site, as well as sediment. And surface water was pretty much unimpacted. There were some very, very low levels of two metals in surface water, but they were so low that they're negligible concentrations with respect to the human health risk. And so those were not quantified. When we looked at future exposures, we looked at a future construction worker excavating during, say, a redevelopment scenario. We also evaluated a future resident exposed to soil. Primarily, that was in the sort of northern portion of the site. However, we also looked at a future residential exposure in AOC 5, simply as the resident, assessing a resident is assessing sort of the highest exposed long-term receptor. So it's kind of a conservative way to evaluate a broad breadth of potential future exposures. And then, so I think that's the high points of the exposure assessment. Section 4 of the report is the toxicity assessment. That's also sometimes called the dose response assessment. And that's where we identify quantitative toxicity factors that are used to assess risk. And in this case, we prioritized, per the MCP regulations, we prioritized mass DEP toxicity factors when they were available. We also supplemented those with some additional toxicity factors for some PFAS constituents that are not the PFAS-6. Mass DEP provides toxicity factors for PFAS-6, and then we added some additional EPA EPA toxicity factors to assess some additional PFAS compounds. Finally, Section 5 is the risk characterization, and that's where it brings together everything from the previous sections to quantify risks, and then for each of those exposure scenarios, and then compare those to risk limits. And separate risk limits are developed for cancer effects versus non-cancer effects. So Gina, if you want to go to the next slide. So these are the sort of the conclusions at the top here. So from Section 5 discusses human health non-cancer risks and cancer risks. For non-cancer risks, which pretty much is anything other than a cancer outcome, right? So that could be effects to the neurological system or to your skin or to your liver. Those are calculated and then summed together. And so for current exposures, the trespassing exposures, all risks are lower than the risk limit. And the risk limit for non-cancer risks is a hazard index or an HI equal to or less than 1 is considered passing, right? Is no significant risk. Above a hazard index above 1 indicates that there is the potential for significant risk. So for current exposures, all exposures across the site were lower than the risk limit. For future exposures, we had the future trespassing exposures also were lower than the risk limit, but some of the other exposures were above the non-cancer risk limit, including there was a sample of lead in AOC4 soil. The concentration was at 520 milligrams per kilogram, and that resulted in an excess risk or a risk above one for a future residential exposure. Second, there's a lead hotspot in AOC6 that is down at depth, but when I assumed a future construction scenario, an excavation scenario, the construction worker risk associated with exposure to that lead did exceed one, the risk limit. I did not assume a future residential exposure in AOC6 soil, as I'll discuss in a moment. And then finally, future residential exposures to PFAS-6 and thallium in drinking water also exceeded the risk limits. The PFAS-6 was in 3 wells, groundwater from 3 wells. To assess drinking water, we look well by well. So 3 wells had excess risk for PFAS. 1 well had excess risk for thallium. And that thallium well is the most kind of down gradient well, and we did not see thallium sort of up gradient in groundwater or in soil or sediment. So I think we're not sure exactly where it's coming from, but certainly I still assess the risk associated with it. For cancer risks are assessed as a probability of excess cancer. And the risk limit is a cancer risk of 1 in 100,000 people exposed, or 1 times 10 to the minus 5. And all excess lifetime cancer risks, or ELCRs, were lower than 1 times 10 to the minus 5. So we did not identify any excess cancer risk at the site. So the method 3 relied on assumptions for what's called activity and use limitations. And what an activity and use limitation is a restriction on the deed, essentially, for future use. And it's not something that needs to be applied until the site is closed, but I did make these assumptions for the risk characterization, and I've identified them here. So one of them has to do with the radiological assessment assumed commercial industrial exposures in AOC5. So I included that here. Second, we assumed that LNAPL present in the subsurface in the environment would not be directly contacted. Third, we restricted the exposures in AOC6, so a construction worker could go in there, but I did not include a future residential exposure in AOC6. Buildings may require assessment for vapor intrusion prior to occupancy, and that's in the area of LNAPL in case there's any petroleum vapors that may be remaining, which that just would require some further assessment prior to occupancy. And then finally, I assumed that the site would not be used for agricultural purposes in the future, and that if gardening was to occur, say in a future residential scenario, best management practices would be implemented. And that basically means that rather than using this existing site soil to grow produce, clean soil would be brought in. In addition to assessing human health risks, we also looked at risks to safety and to public welfare. The safety risks, and these are risks identified in the MCP, and a condition of no significant risk has been achieved for the risks to safety, and that's based on information provided by SLR. And for public welfare, a condition of no significant risk was not achieved, and that was based on the presence of lead in AOC6 at the hotspot above what's called a method 3 ceiling limit. And that's basically a concentration that DEP identifies that could be a potential source of contamination for future exposures. And so some additional sampling has been done. And actually, I just got the data this afternoon and wish I'd had a chance to look at it before this meeting, but I haven't, to sort of understand whether that's, how big of an issue that is. And based on my brief review of it, I did not see any other concentrations in the additional samples above the ceiling limit. Um, and I, but again, I have not had a chance to look into that. Um, when I talked about no significant risk, I will say that for human health, we also concluded that no significant risk was not achieved. And that was based on those um, non-cancer risks above the risk limits, as well as the presence of PFAS 6 in groundwater in the GW1 area above Massachusetts maximum contaminant levels. Those are drinking water standards. So that was my brief summary. Gina, you can
Okay.
take it away.
Yeah. So, Matt tried to impart some knowledge on me about radiological risks from radium. And as you can see in this slide, the process that was used for assessment of those risks, and the extent of the nature and extent was based on an established agency approach used by US EPA and other agencies, Mass DEP. Initially, the most conservative calculation of what's called the DCGL, or what I'm calling here as a guideline level, was 0.24 picocuries per gram. That considered a very conservative farming approach, which is how low would the concentration need to be if you grew vegetables and ate those, if you drank milk from cows that foraged on site, if you ate fish from a pond that was on site. Under that conservative calculation, the average concentration would need to be, or all concentrations would need to be below 0.24 picocuries per gram. However, because the site is considered for industrial commercial use, that DCLG or guideline, DCGL, excuse me, or guideline level was adjusted to 3 picocuries per gram. And that guideline level is protective under the currently proposed future use, which again is commercial industrial. But that doesn't mean there can't be alternative future uses. It's just that those uses would require reassessment of the guideline level. And I think, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, we didn't see any much above 3 that, like in sediment or anything outside of that 911 cubic yards, right?
Yeah, that the 911 cubic yards represents what would be above that. And, our data says that this is shallow from 6 inches to 3.5 feet. So we are really talking about surface soils in all capacities.
Excellent. All right, so finishing this up, I won't go through this slide in detail. Here's some key findings from how we broke it up, how Denise did in the risk assessment from the northern portions of the site. All the historical remediation work that was done seems to have been adequate. LNAPL distributions they seem to be consistent and stable. They don't seem to have dissolved phase impacts. And things are just looking pretty good aside from the LNAPL up in that area. We do have that isolated detection of lead in AOC4, which did pose an unacceptable risk, and that will be evaluated as part of the phase 3. In the southern portion of the site, these are the 2 AOCs where we did a lot of work. AOC5, the wastewater treatment filter beds. We do have the radium-226 in shallow soils, as Matt indicated, and we do have that low PFAS detection, but not indicative of a historical release from hospital operations. And in AOC6, that former waste disposal area, the soil analytical results did show a lead hotspot. As Denise mentioned, we did get analytical data today from the resampling that we did a couple weeks ago to further define the extent of that hotspot, and it looks like it was pretty isolated. So we're going to continue, Denise is going to continue to look at the risks associated with that and how we deal with that. All Matt's work in the waste disposal area, aside from a pocket watch, showed radium-226 below the guideline levels, and PFAS in soil and groundwater barely exceeded the Method 1 standards, and those concentrations were not indicative of an on-site source. The last portion of our report identifies data gaps and next steps. Our first data gap is the extent of PFAS in soil and groundwater. You've been hearing me say all along, not indicative of a source on site, not indicative of a source on site. However, we're going to continue to evaluate PFAS as part of future response actions because, like Denise was saying, concentrations in groundwater do exceed they provide unacceptable risks associated with potentially drinking those under future conditions. So we are going to continue to look. We're going to continue to discuss with Mass DEP how they might want us to address this, probably additional groundwater sampling rounds for temporal data and future assessment on how to deal with those exceedances of PFAS. Our second data gap is that AOC 6 lead hotspot area, and we did the sampling. Our goal of the sampling was to eliminate the data gap prior to issuing the final phase 2 CS report, and we're well on our way to doing that. Our schedule for remaining activities. We've received the analytical results for the AOC 6 soil sampling. We have this public comment period extending 20 days, ending February 23rd. We have a response to comments, to your comments, which is due on April 23rd, and then we'll have the submittal of the final phase 2 CSA scheduled on or before May 23rd. And we do anticipate that our phase 3, our remedial action plan and evaluation of alternatives, will be initiated in 2026. Oops. And I believe with that, we're ready for your questions and comments. Just a reminder here, if you have written questions, those are the 2 email addresses you can submit them to, and we will make sure that the right person answers your question.
Thank you, Gina, and Denise. We appreciate that. We might want to keep. Let's start by keep the presentation handy, Gina, in case part of the questions we want to bring that up. So let's see. I think the probably the best approach right now is if we can raise our hand via the tool, the Zoom tool. Trying to figure out where it is here.
I am not seeing it either.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it.
Or maybe just put them in the chat. Questions in the chat.
Yeah, how come I'm not?
It's under reactions. You have to go to reactions at the bottom, and you'll see. You click that. You'll see raise hand. There's a bunch of emojis, and then.
Oh yeah. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
And with that, I'll raise my hand first.
All right. If you're up, you got it.
More just general comments. I guess. Sanborn Head did some work out there. How come that work is nowhere to be found? And that I don't know if they were a contractor with Earth Tech. And the only reason why I know is because I was out there with them in the early 2000s. They were asking some questions. I was on the Conservation Commission at the time. So I guess that's something I'm not clear why. I mean, I've seen one report from them, but I don't know, if that was overlooked or was determined to be redundant from the Earth Tech stuff, because I know that they were looking in the same area. But my primary reason for being out there was because when they built the ambulance garage, we had diesel or number 2 fuel oil flowing out of a side bank. And being on the Conservation Commission, I told them, don't worry about filing a notice of intent. We can do it after the fact, because they were so concerned about the excavation filling up with diesel fuel. It was coming in pretty quickly. So that's a general comment. I noticed at the beginning of the talk, you had said that dumping at the disposal area stopped in 1972. It went on a lot longer than that. The only reason why is because the Conservation Commission also in the late 90s had asked the hospital to cover the waste that had been buried there. I went out there, there were still pharmaceuticals. I distinctly recall an X-ray machine that was sort of half crushed, but not buried. And it was buried eventually. And that was in the late 90s. And I can tell you there wasn't a lot of rust on it, and I have no idea why. And then as things would have it, if you fast forward to the early 2000s before they left, the hospital, when it was still Caritas, was running the facility, they were sending letters to the Department of Correction, who I worked for at the time, and they wanted money to clean up the dump area because they said the Department of Correction had been dumping stuff there. A simple pushback saying, prove it, produce nothing. Coincidentally, in 2005 and 2007, there was a dumping area behind MCI Norfolk that I cleaned up as the LSP of record for that. And I took pictures of material as well as equipment that had Southwood tags on them. So those were tagged and bagged essentially in case they ever need them again to say, look, we got some stuff of yours. Why don't you pay for us, pay us to get rid of that. So there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect. So I'm not quite sure that date of 1972 of the last dumping is accurate by any means. So that's one thing. I guess the area of the area of concern 3, back 96 to 97, Wadley Environmental actually had proposed to come in front of the Conservation Commission to relocate that stream, and they wanted to put some sort of barrier in there because what was happening is when the stream would flood, it would cut into the bank where they'd been dumping waste, and stuff was getting carried downstream. That never happened, just so you know. But the concern I have is that could that flooding have been attributed to some of the radium-226 that you're seeing? There's people on the PIP group that spoke with 2 former a son and father that worked at the facility, and they said they were told to clean out the incinerators and dump it. Having worked for a state facility for over 20 years, believe me, I know that their record keeping is horrible. And that's something that has to be looked at. So I would not challenge, but I would raise questions whether that the statement that the radium found in the area of concern 3 is background. It very well could have been windblown. It could have been physically dumped there. The one thing I've noticed from working on at some of the prisons that do have train tracks is that bank is a perfect spot for dumping because you can dump it at the top and then nature does its thing and eventually it smooths itself out. So that's something that I don't know if that was looked at. I don't know if that was a possible scenario when you did the data, but that's what I've got there. And I guess the last thing more for DDES is the question of reaching the limit of 3 when you were doing the radiation assessment. Was that the goal? Because some of the test borings or some of the samples that were collected in the filter beds you never got to 3. So I guess how can you extrapolate, or how did you extrapolate a volume from that if you haven't gotten the bottom? And I'll leave it at that.
You're gonna will you put
Yep.
those will be in writing, right,
Yep.
Andy? With the comments. Yep.
Yep, I will.
Yep.
Bill, I'll send them to you and to Gina.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yep.
And Matt, do you want to address the 3.0, or would you rather some time to think about that?
No, I think I can address the 3.0, and I want to make sure that I understand the question as best as I can. When we were out in doing our screening, you saw a lot of borings that were shallow borings. You saw borings that were deeper. We had a field laboratory that was able to give us a detection limit of half of the 3, if you will. So we continue to soil samples to sample soils at depth of 6-inch increments until we were at background levels for a couple of intervals. So basically, that's how we were able to define the vertical extent and say that we're ranging from that 6 inches in some areas to 3.5 feet. So we were able to get that definitive vertical extent while we were on site. We're also able to get the lateral extent as well using that same methodology. So it was very iterative where we get real-time data when we're in the field and doing that soils analysis. That very much mimics what we saw or what you do see in actual fixed-based analysis. So we use the same gamma spec method, if you will, just not quite as finite as being on a lab bench.
Matt, thank you. I will be honest. I mean, I've looked at data for 40 plus years working in the environmental field, and the issue I have is I can't figure out the depths, whether it's a presentation issue or it's just something isn't. It's not easy for me, and I'd like to think I'm fairly smart to figure out where you've done this. I mean, I've done the same thing, documenting the horizontal and vertical extent, but the information, the way it's presented, I'm lost. I'll be honest with you. I just can't quite figure out how you're getting the depth. I mean, what you've described is not well articulated in the report. That might be part of it. I don't know if doing a cross section at one or two locations and show something that might be beneficial. From the perspective of, with DEP is going to be overseeing the standards for this, unless DPH has taken this back over. Because I remember when we first started the project, and when they first found the radiation, they were going to DEP said they would take the lead on this one. So
it's my understanding DPH will remain involved. That DEP will be, they'll be consulting DEP on that. But Matt, could I ask you to just briefly cover how so the 911 cubic yards, and this is just my layman's understanding of this, is an estimate only. It's not a fixed amount, and that the final amount of what gets removed from the site will be determined in real time in the field. Could you just briefly cover that, Matt?
Basically, what we will do is we will set up that same mobile laboratory when we're out in the field doing the excavations that are there. And we've done this on a couple of different sites in Mass very successfully, radium sites, in that we go in and define the areas and we remove and excavate, and we do our lifetime sampling of your extents of the excavation, if you will. Take those points, do our analysis on site to determine whether or not a soil sample is going to pass the criteria when it's sent off to the field laboratory. So basically, we'll come into an area where we know we have elevated measurements above our 3, and we will remove those areas and we will test them live time to determine when it is time to stop excavating. And we'll continue to excavate as long as we see those levels in our field screening gamma spectroscopy. We'll then confirm that with physical samples of those excavation extents that will go on to a third-party laboratory, general engineering laboratory, for the final. And the fixed-based analysis is the final determination of whether or not something meets the criteria. Following along with that, each one of these AOCs, the filter beds themselves, will be considered a separate survey unit, which we will follow the required approach according to NEREG 1757, which is MARSAM, that defines how many samples that we're supposed to obtain from that, so that we can statistically prove that a survey unit meets the criteria established for this industrial level of 3.0. So it's going to be a very much iterative approach, and I don't think it's going to be 911. That is an estimate, and like you said, Bill, that it is our best guess at it, because we are talking about a lot of areas that are 6 inches, in depth. So basically, we're out after a lot of the sandy areas that were part of these filter beds, and then some of that organic matter that they have raked to the sides to clear those beds themselves.
Great. Karen? Unmute you.
Thanks, Bill.
Oh.
So just to go back to one of Andy's comments, as you know, the PIP team did interview an awful lot of people that worked in the lab and worked at the hospital for many, many years. And I believe it was Ronnie Eisner, who worked down in the lab, and he used to talk about during the winter months, after radium had been, put in someone's organ or limb, and when it did not, do the work of taking care of the cancer in their tumor, the arm was, taken off and put in the incinerator, and then they had the radium in that ash. And depending on the time of year, they used to put that ash in wheelbarrows and then go out and dump it wherever they could. Certainly, how much snow we've had this time of year.
Yep.
They would just go find an area somewhere in the woods, wasn't always the wastewater beds, and there the ash would be dumped. So I was just looking at your slide that I think Andy referred to, the radium-226 and stream and sediment surface, and you did have some notes behind the ambulance garage and a little bit further off behind the power plant that were kind of the red hot spots. And that might actually be some of the areas they put some of that ash. So I did want to mention that. But my question specifically is, what we're concentrating, or you guys, your testing has been concentrating on the wastewater beds, but what about all these other areas that have been told by these workers that the ash could be out to the left of these buildings that no one's even, have you run a Geiger counter over there to see what radium levels are there? So that's my question.
Yeah. I will say we haven't seen those mounds or piles of debris that on the site in our findings. They're just not, they're not evident as to where that dumping may have been. We've always also gone under the human nature of that dumping and knowing that it's likely they're dumping that downhill, right? So that they're not taking it uphill on the site in those wheelbarrows. So they're coming down, and likely, if that ash was being dumped, I'm sure it's, they use that walkway or, it could be some in the wastewater beds like we found. So I'm not an expert on this though, so I should probably just let the experts answer that. But Matt, is that something we want to think about as far as Karen's concerns there?
So what I was going to say is that looking at the figure where they talked about sampling in sediments, if you take a look, about what radium is naturally present in soils, we've got, uranium and granite. Radium is part of that decay chain of that uranium. And we see around 1 picocurie per gram on average in most sites in Massachusetts. So when we're taking a look at their sediment samples, I noticed that a number of those were below 1, a little above 1, when we're taking a review of those. So basically, that is approximation of background. If there is dumping, they're looking at the areas where there would have been water ran off, and we did sample and look at, what the sediments were in there. So that's one of the things that we have to keep in mind in the levels that I see right here. If we're talking about, 1.25 picocuries, I'm not going to be able to see that in a walkover survey. I won't see any response from a Geiger counter, even directly on those soils themselves, because they are basically essentially very, very low background.
Great. I would like to follow up with Karen, though. Karen, I want to follow up with you. I want to give you an answer on that ash and whether or not we would find radium in that ash in that scenario that you just described, where there was an amputation. So I'm gonna put that in writing to us, and I want to get you an answer on that. Sandra's iPhone, I see. So I'm not sure if that's.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. It was very good presentation. I will echo some of Andy's concerns with just the amounts that you said you were going to take out. I know you've said, well, it's just an estimate at this point, but the DDES report doesn't, if you look at the survey units and you add up the square footage and then you do the calculation for the cubic feet, it doesn't have you going down more than, or they're all less than 2 feet if you back out the volume from the area. That's just one, maybe there be another way to present the data, because I just can't think you're only going to go down 2 feet when it looks like you, and somebody, I forget the gentleman's name, Matt said that you went down further, but it's not in the report, so I'll write the questions up, but one of them, it just shows that you went down to 1.5 feet in like survey unit 14. And the reading is still, over 1,000 picocuries per gram. So I don't know why there isn't more data presented. That would be helpful. So the other question I had was, if you look on the elevation drawings that the contours are shown with the survey units, there is another, you can see it, another filter bed, and that would be west of survey unit 12.
Yeah, not these cross sections, I don't think, right? I think.
Right, you'd have to go to the DDES report.
Oh, the DDES report.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it has, there is another, you can see it from the contour elevations. I'll put it in writing and give you the reference, but I'm just wondering why that wasn't even looked at.
Where would it be on this
Okay,
graphic,
so
Andy? Is it on the other side of the
line of 4?
Is it the one on the other side of the walkway?
All right, so there were 2 on the other side of the walkway, which you did look at.
Yeah.
And then there's one, do you see how there's a row of 4? And then your row of 3 is actually the one below it. There should be 4, there should be 4 there, including the one that you added 16. Right. So see, the one that's missing is the one to the far left on the bottom row.
Oh.
I don't think that's been looked
in that
at.
vicinity where the cursor is right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So go to the yellow. No,
That's also where the pump house is. Yeah.
Well, no, I actually think it's the one right, you show it there, right? These are not quite the same orientation on this map as the DDES report. So
Yeah.
I don't know. There is one more right below.
Yep.
You can see it when you look at the contours. So I'll write it up.
Yep.
It's also in the historical map. I think you did include that in the report. There's a historical map which shows there's also another one further up.
Yep.
And that's not looked at either. And then there's some areas outside of the survey units that were greater than 2 times background that don't get accounted for in these calculations. So I'm wondering, are you going to go outside the survey units?
Yes, basically, we are going to go outside the survey units. What we see is, especially in that side where the ravine is, you've got a slope that's there that basically we're going to have to take that material off the slope anywhere that's in there. Basically, the reason that there's separation in these survey units that we have is because of the actual physical growth of materials and trees and shrubbery that's there. The idea is that when it comes time to remediate this, all the survey units that have exceedances that are there, they're going to be pursued, to their fullest extent laterally and vertically. So that hopefully answers a little bit of the question. I've been out there on site walking these over, and I see that we may have combined 2 of these particular, filter beds, at that base. We'll take a look at it and see, where's there. But anywhere that there was a filter bed that was present and visible, it's been walked over, it's been looked at, to make sure the initial screening, hey, is it twice background? Is it not? Is there a concern with that? And then, we gave our primary effort to those that we knew were impacted and trying to look at the most, get the most information about how deep and how wide those were, respectfully when it's a safe area for us to be, and understanding that, hey, there are some slopes that we were not able to evaluate, and there was some dense growth in between several areas that, we couldn't get through to get a physical sample on either. Our hope is that those areas where we have those physical divides have been there for years and years. And so that would be areas where they wouldn't be pulling material toward. Again, we're using that site model of, hey, you want to pull, if you're raking material out of one of these filter beds, you're going to rake it in the easiest direction possible to either get that material out or get that material where it is, in a dewatering area to be loaded out.
Thank you, Matt. Andy, I do just want to point out while we're on this graphic here that several of the samples shown here are from that Sanborn Head report that you mentioned. So there might have just been an oversight in not listing them in that initial list of categories. But it appears here that their findings, which I'm sure we did, are included in the report.
Yeah, Bill, I'll be honest with you. My contact with the woman that was a Sanborn Head person.
Yeah.
I used to work with at another company many years before that, and she knew I lived in Norfolk, so she called over and realized I was on the Conservation Commission, so kind of helped them move along so they get the assessment done on this, and then that was it. The fact they never filed with the Conservation Commission.
Yeah.
It's not. Yeah. So it's just one piece of the puzzle that. Really, what did they do? And it's just makes it more complete.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that we did that. That data is included. Yep.
Okay. So
we got about 3 minutes left. I'm not seeing anyone else's hand. I did see a question in the chat that let me pull up here from Mr. Turi. When do you plan to come in front of the Norfolk Town boards? So we really wouldn't be planning to come in front of the town boards. Really, it's the Planning Board and the Conservation Commission for the redevelopment of the site. And while we've made a lot of progress with the zoning, we have started the civil engineering for the redevelopment, and beyond the conceptual plans that we had for the zoning change. But we're feeling like we need to, before we get in front of the town boards, we need to at least have some idea of what our phase 3 alternatives are going to look like, right? Because likely our project, we're going to be proposing our project as a potential remedy in some of these areas, right? Or our project will maybe serve as a part of the remedy. So. We want to make sure that we've fully exhausted what's going to need to happen in the remediation, or at least be able to communicate that to you in conjunction with the filing of our plans with the Planning Board and the Conservation Commission. So with that being said, we had said on an earlier slide that we do want to initiate our phase 3 activities this year. So I want to do that simultaneously. I want to be doing the plans for the redevelopment. So I'm hoping that maybe probably early summer, maybe late summer, we're actually filing with the town. So hope that answers your question, David. And yes, Sandra, we can send a copy of this of the slides. Karen, you have your hand raised?
Of course, you know me.
Yeah, good.
More of just a comment, and I probably go back to maybe 2-3 years ago. where we did offer for you or anyone else to walk the property with many of these people that we have interviewed that worked on the property. If you want to learn any of the history, a visual history walkthrough,
Yeah.
there are plenty of people willing to do that with you. So just
Okay.
throwing that offer out there. Certainly not right now with all the snow cover, but
Yeah.
sometime in
Right.
the spring,
Right.
you can
We
make that
appreciate that. I know Bob has met with some of those folks, right?
Yes, but we didn't actually do a walkthrough. Those were a couple of the offsite meetings we had.
Okay. Yeah.
But just throwing that out there again, Bill.
Yeah. Thank you, Karen.
Yep. Thank you so much for tonight's meeting.
Yeah. Any other questions we can answer for anyone before we cut this? So I will send the slides, and if I figure this out, do I also share the recording with you? Is that
So that will probably be big. I actually can coordinate with NCTV, the recording. I'll get you Andrew's email address and you can send it to him and hopefully he can get it up on NCTV. So it's
okay? All right. You're going to test my technological capacity here.
Thanks.
Yeah. Anyone else? All right. That's great. 7:30 on the nose. So well done, everyone. And so again, big thanks to our team, all the work that they've put into this site. Big thanks to the PIP group for your insight, your guidance. It's you will see in the report that that there's definitely some input that from you that we've incorporated into the study. So we greatly appreciate that, and we look forward to this becoming a success story. Right? There's been more happened here in the last couple of years than the entire 20 plus or maybe 30 plus years before that, as far as assessment stuff. So we're proud of that, and we're proud of our work to communicate that to you. So, all right, you know how to reach us. Oh, Betsy, is that you raising your hand? We're gonna have to unmute you. If it wasn't you, Betsy, I might have just.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
As a novice, this is not what I went to college for. I taught first grade for 40 years. I just have to remind myself and everybody that I worry about two locations, period. The Stop River, because it's all over the place, and Valley Street, because we are mighty close to this site. I wrote a book about Pondville, as you know. I spent 3.5 years.
Yep.
And I cannot really rest when I think two locations, Stop River, which is all over the place, and Valley Street, which isn't. But that Stop River, I walk up and down Valley Street many times a week picking up trash.
Yeah.
It's floating in the Stop River.
Mm.
And that's just somebody. I've lived here since 1982. And I worry.
Yeah.
Because I love the Stop River and I love Valley Street and I love the little hamlet that was so important and founded by Daniel Pond. Everett Street was utilized back in the 1680s. Pondville was a little before that. It's mighty historic. So I am like a Mother Hubbard taking care of it. Thank you for listening.
All right. Thank you, Betsy. That's a great closing, I think, actually. So, okay, everyone, please reach out. You have my contact information. Please reach out if there's any other additional questions. So we'll get your comments by the 23rd, and then and hopefully we're going to respond to them faster than the 60 days we're allowed. But Bob's going to kick me for committing to that. But we're going to try, right? Yeah. And okay. Thanks again, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you.
Yep.
Good night,
Thanks
everyone.
very
much,
Nice to meet you all.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.